Jamaica's national fruit cannot be legally imported into the United States in its fresh form. It has not been importable that way since the 1970s, and the ban remains active today, enforced through something called Import Alert 21-11, which authorizes United States Customs to automatically detain any ackee product arriving at a port of entry unless the manufacturer appears on a specific list of approved processors the FDA maintains. The fruit is called ackee, and the reason for the restriction has nothing to do with politics or trade disputes. It has to do with a compound called hypoglycin A, present throughout the plant, concentrated most dangerously in the fruit before it ripens. Ackee grows inside a pod that starts green and eventually turns red, and inside that pod the edible portion, a pale yellow flesh called the aril, sits alongside a black seed and a red membrane. The critical detail, the one that separates a normal breakfast in Kingston from a medical emergency, is that the pod has to open on its own. Force it open early, before the fruit has naturally ripened, and the aril inside still carries hypoglycin A at levels the FDA considers roughly 10 times higher than what is deemed safe to consume. Wait for the pod to split open by itself, which happens as the fruit fully matures, and the toxin level in the aril drops enough to be eaten safely, provided the seed and membrane are removed and discarded, since those parts remain toxic even in a fully ripe fruit. Hypoglycin A does something specific inside the body. It interferes with the metabolic pathway that converts stored fat into usable energy, specifically blocking an enzyme involved in fatty acid oxidation. When that pathway is blocked, the body's blood sugar can crash severely, because it loses one of its main backup systems for maintaining glucose levels between meals. The resulting condition has a name that predates modern toxicology by more than a century. Jamaican vomiting sickness, first documented among plantation workers and their families in the 1700s and 1800s, characterized by sudden, severe vomiting followed by profound hypoglycemia, muscular weakness, and in serious cases seizures, coma, and death. It disproportionately affected children eating unripe fruit that had fallen from trees before maturing, and it disproportionately affected people during periods of food scarcity, when an unripe ackee looked like food rather than a risk. This history explains why the FDA's response, once American food safety regulators became aware of ackee imports in the 20th century, was total exclusion rather than a labeling requirement or a ripeness standard enforced at the border. A fruit that looks nearly identical whether it is safely ripe or dangerously unripe, whose safety depends on a natural process that cannot be verified by appearance alone once it has been picked and shipped, is difficult to regulate through inspection. Prohibition of the fresh product was the blunt instrument available, and it stayed in place for decades. What changed by the early 2000s was not the fruit. It was the ability to test for hypoglycin A reliably and cheaply enough to apply at an industrial scale. Once laboratories could measure the toxin's concentration in a batch of processed ackee quickly, the FDA created a pathway for canned and frozen ackee to enter the country, provided the processor could demonstrate, batch by batch, that hypoglycin A stayed under 100 parts per million. Processors that consistently met this standard earned a place on what the agency calls its green list, and ackee from those processors, always canned or frozen, never fresh, is what appears on American grocery shelves today, most commonly imported from Jamaica, though also from Belize and Haiti, among other tropical exporting countries. The claim that ackee is banned in exactly 3 countries shows up often enough in headlines and short-form content that it is worth addressing directly, because the number gets repeated more confidently than the underlying documentation supports. What is thoroughly documented, down to the specific import alert number and the exact toxin threshold, is the United States restriction. Beyond that, several major food import markets, including countries across the European Union and Canada, apply similarly strict controls on any fresh produce carrying a regulated natural toxin above safe thresholds, which functions as a de facto barrier to fresh ackee even without a headline-ready standalone ban specific to the fruit. The honest version of this story is not that 3 named governments each passed a law targeting ackee by name. It is that the fruit's fresh form struggles to clear the general food safety bar most wealthy import markets set for naturally toxic produce, and the United States is simply the case where that struggle is documented in the most public specific detail. Ackee's own migration story predates any of these modern regulations by roughly 2 centuries. The tree is native to West Africa, and enslaved people transported to Jamaica during the transatlantic slave trade brought the plant with them sometime in the 1700s, likely aboard slave ships, though the exact route remains debated among botanical historians. Captain William Bligh, more famous for surviving a mutiny on a different ship entirely, is sometimes credited with formally introducing the plant to Jamaica in the late 18th century, though the more grounded historical record suggests it was already established there through the same forced migration that brought so much of West African cuisine to the Caribbean. The plant's scientific name, Blaya sapida, preserves his name regardless of who actually gets credit for planting the first tree. None of this history changes what ackee actually is nutritionally, which is where the doctors still recommending it come in. A properly ripened, correctly prepared aril carries a meaningful amount of essential fatty acids, a nutrient profile unusual enough for a fruit that it is sometimes compared to avocado in texture and fat content, rather than to anything typically classified alongside mangoes or papayas. It carries vitamin C, zinc, and a measurable amount of protein for a plant food, along with dietary fiber. In Jamaica, where ackee paired with saltfish is effectively the national dish, physicians and nutritionists do not treat it as a hazard to be avoided. They treat it the way any country's medical establishment treats a staple food with a known preparation risk, the way raw milk cheese or certain wild mushrooms are handled in other food cultures, with public education about correct preparation rather than blanket rejection of the food itself. This is a genuinely different posture than the one American regulators adopted, and the gap between the two is not really a disagreement about the fruit's safety when properly prepared. It is a disagreement about what a food safety system optimizes for. Jamaica's relationship with ackee runs through generations of accumulated household knowledge about when a pod has actually finished ripening, when to discard fruit that fell from the tree too early, and how to prepare it correctly. Transmitted the way any traditional food safety practice gets transmitted, parent to child, market vendor to customer. The American regulatory system has no equivalent transmission mechanism for a population unfamiliar with the fruit, so it defaults to exclusion at the border, rather than trusting consumer education to prevent poisoning cases at scale. A Jamaican cook preparing ackee at home follows a set of rules that would strike an American grocery shopper as unusually specific for a piece of fruit. Only pods that have opened naturally on the tree, never a pod pried open by hand, ever get harvested. Any fruit that has fallen to the ground gets left there, since a fall can bruise or split a pod that was not actually ready, and the visual difference between a fully ripe fall and a premature one is not reliable enough to bet a family's health on. The yellow arils get separated carefully from the black seeds and the red membrane lining the inside of the pod, both of which are set aside and discarded, rather than composted anywhere livestock or children might get to them. The arils themselves typically get boiled before final preparation, a step that further reduces any residual toxin, before being sautéed with saltfish, onions, and Scotch bonnet pepper into the dish most visitors to Jamaica actually encounter. This is not folklore dressed up as food safety. It is a preparation sequence refined over roughly 200 years of a population learning, sometimes at serious cost, exactly where the danger in this fruit lives and how to remove it before it reaches a plate. There is a reasonable middle position between these two extremes that the canned product represents. Processing ackee in Jamaica or another exporting country, under supervision that can verify ripeness and test toxin levels before the product ever leaves the facility, removes the judgment call from an American consumer who has no cultural training in recognizing a properly ripened pod. The trade-off is texture and flavor. Canned ackee is softer, milder, and by most accounts of people who have eaten both versions, meaningfully different from fresh ackee prepared in Jamaica, closer in the way canned versus fresh vegetables generally differ, just with a higher stake attached to the fresh version if the preparation goes wrong. Cases of hypoglycin poisoning still occur, almost entirely in regions where ackee grows wild or semi-wild, and where the fruit is a normal part of the food supply, and almost always tied to periods of food insecurity, when unripe fruit becomes tempting out of necessity rather than ignorance. Public health researchers studying outbreaks in West Africa, where the plant originated before being brought to Jamaica in the 18th century, have documented clusters of cases tightly correlated with drought years and lean agricultural seasons, which reframes the danger less as a property of the fruit and more as a risk that surfaces specifically when normal ripening practices get abandoned under pressure. None of this makes ackee an unusual food, in the broader context of how humans eat. A surprising number of foods considered ordinary and safe require specific preparation to neutralize a natural toxin entirely. Cassava requiring processing to remove cyanogenic compounds. Raw kidney beans containing a lectin dangerous enough that improperly soaked beans cause documented poisoning cases every year. Fugu requiring a licensed chef trained specifically in removing the fish's toxic organs. Ackee sits on that same spectrum, a food that is dangerous in one specific, well-understood, and entirely avoidable state, and safe in the state most people actually eat it in. What makes ackee worth naming in a conversation about superfoods rather than simply a curiosity is that its nutritional case does not depend on the danger at all. The essential fatty acid content, the protein, the vitamin C, none of that changes based on how the fruit is regulated in a country most ackee is never eaten in. A Jamaican grandmother serving ackee and saltfish on a Sunday morning is not taking a risk her American counterpart has correctly avoided. She is eating a fruit her family has known how to prepare safely for generations, one that happens to be difficult to regulate at scale in a country with no equivalent tradition, which is a fact about trade and food safety infrastructure, not a fact about the fruit's actual worth on a plate.